This content is presented for educational, historical, and cultural analysis purposes. All theological interpretations shared here reflect the views of various scholars and traditions, and should be understood as according to the interpretation of unredacted rather than absolute doctrinal claims. Viewers are encouraged to study, verify, and form their own understanding through personal research and spiritual guidance.
There is a passage in the Hebrew Bible that has made readers uncomfortable for centuries. A man of God is walking down a road. A group of young people come out of a nearby town and begin mocking him. He turns around, looks at them, and speaks a curse. Moments later, according to the text, 2 bears emerge from the woods and maul 42 of them. That's it. That's the story. 12 verses into the 4th chapter of 2 Kings. Actually, it's in chapter 2. And we have one of the most jarring, most debated, most theologically uncomfortable passages in all of ancient scripture. People have been asking the same question ever since. How does this fit with a God described elsewhere as compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love? And more specifically, what does it say about Elisha, who is presented throughout the books of Kings as one of Israel's greatest prophets? Today we're going to take that question seriously. Not with easy answers, not with dismissals, but with the same tools that historians, textual scholars, archaeologists, and theologians have brought to this passage across centuries of careful study. Because the honest answer is more layered and ultimately more interesting than either God was right to do it or this proves the Bible is barbaric. Let's start at the beginning. Before we can understand the bear incident, we need to understand who Elisha was, both as a figure in the text and as a character within the broader prophetic tradition of ancient Israel. Elisha appears in the books of Kings as the successor to Elijah, one of the most prominent prophets in the Hebrew Bible. The transition between them is itself one of the most dramatic scenes in ancient religious literature. Elijah ascending in a whirlwind, a chariot of fire, and Elisha receiving what the text describes as a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Scholars who study the books of Kings, people like John Gray, whose commentary on Kings remains a standard reference, and more recently, scholars like Walter Brueggemann, note that the Elisha cycle, meaning the collection of stories centered on Elisha in 2 Kings chapters 2 through 13, has a distinctive literary character. It reads, in places, almost like a collection of independent miracle stories, what scholars sometimes call legendary material, woven together into a larger narrative. This is important context because it means the bear story isn't an isolated oddity. It sits within a tradition of stories about prophetic power that includes raising the dead, purifying poisoned water, multiplying food, and making iron float. The Elisha cycle, according to many scholars, possibly reflects oral traditions that circulated among prophetic communities, groups sometimes called sons of the prophets in the text itself, before being incorporated into the written narrative of Kings. This doesn't tell us what really happened, but it does tell us that the stories were preserved and transmitted by communities for whom prophetic power and divine authority were central concerns, and that the literary genre we're reading shapes how we should interpret individual episodes within it. Let's be precise about what 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, actually says, because popular retellings often get details wrong, and the details matter. The Hebrew text says that Elisha went up to Bethel. On the way, some Naarim Ketanim, a Hebrew phrase, came out of the city and mocked him. They said, according to the text, "Go up, Baldhead, go up, Baldhead." Elisha turned, looked at them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. 2 female bears then came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youth. After this, the text says simply that Elisha went on to Mount Carmel and then returned to Samaria. That's the complete account. No divine explanation is offered. No editorial comment from the narrator. No indication of what happened to the injured. No statement of whether they survived or died, though the Hebrew word used, vatavaka, which means to tear or rip apart, is severe. Now, even before we get to theology, there are several textual and translation questions that scholars have wrestled with for a very long time. First, What does Nearim Ketanim actually mean? The traditional translation is little children or small boys, which is part of what makes the story so disturbing. But Hebrew scholars note that Near, the singular, covers a very wide age range in biblical Hebrew. It can refer to a young child, a teenager, a young adult, or even an attendant or servant. The word is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to describe Joseph at 17, to describe military fighters, and to describe Absalom, who was old enough to lead a military rebellion against his father, King David. According to scholars like John Mauchline and more recently Jacob Milgram, the phrase Nearim Ketanim possibly refers to young men, adolescents, or young adults, rather than small children. Some translations, including certain academic ones, render it as youths or young men. This doesn't resolve the moral question, but it does change the picture somewhat. We are not necessarily talking about toddlers being mauled for laughing at a bald man. We may be talking about a group of young adults engaging in a more deliberate act of public mockery. Second, what does "go up, Baldhead" mean? This is where it gets genuinely interesting. The most surface-level reading is that they were mocking Elisha's physical appearance, his baldness, and that may be part of it. But several scholars have proposed that the taunt carries additional layers of meaning. Some note the phrase "go up," Allah in Hebrew, may echo the language used for Elijah's ascension in the previous chapter. Elijah went up. These youth may possibly be mocking the idea of prophetic ascension itself, sarcastically telling Elisha to go up like his master did, taunting him with the claim that he can't or won't. Others have noted that baldness in the ancient Near East carried specific cultural connotations. In some contexts, it was associated with mourning. In others, according to scholars like Philip King and Lawrence Stagger, who have written on everyday life in ancient Israel, certain prophetic or priestly figures may have shaved their heads as part of their role. If that's the case, mocking Elisha's baldness may have been a direct attack on his prophetic identity and authority, not merely a personal insult. Still, others have suggested that the number 42, a very specific number, may carry symbolic significance within the narrative, rather than being a precise historical count. Numbers in ancient texts frequently carry symbolic weight, and 42 appears elsewhere in biblical and later Jewish literature, in contexts that suggest it may be a literary rather than arithmetic figure. None of these interpretations is definitive, but together they suggest that the passage is more textually complex than a quick reading suggests. Let's not dance around the difficulty here, because I think honest engagement is more valuable than defensive deflection. The theological problem this passage poses is real, and serious readers across centuries have felt it. If Elisha was genuinely a prophet acting in accordance with the character of the God described throughout the Hebrew scriptures, a God who in Exodus is described as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, then why does a curse resulting in physical harm to young people appear to follow a relatively minor provocation? The discomfort is sharpened by comparison. Elsewhere in the prophetic tradition, prophets endure significant mockery, rejection, and even physical abuse without calling down supernatural harm. Jeremiah is thrown into a cistern. Isaiah, apparently, according to later tradition, faces execution. The suffering servant passages in Isaiah describe someone who is despised and rejected without retaliating. And Jesus, in the New Testament tradition, specifically tells his followers not to call down fire on those who reject them, a statement that some early Christian commentators read as a direct contrast with Elijah and Elisha. So the tension is real. How have serious thinkers, people who weren't trying to dismiss the text, handled it? One of the most important things to understand about ancient texts is that the communities who preserved them were often well aware of their difficulties and developed sophisticated interpretive traditions to address them. Jewish interpretive tradition, particularly the rabbinic literature compiled in the Talmud and Midrash, though these post-date the biblical text by centuries, engaged with this passage in interesting ways. Some rabbinic interpretations, according to scholars of Jewish biblical interpretation, like Mark Brettler, suggested that the bears appeared miraculously, the point being the demonstration of prophetic authority, but that the mauling was not necessarily fatal. This reading tries to soften the severity while preserving the supernatural element. Others focused on the severity of the mockery itself. In a cultural context where prophetic authority was central to community life, publicly undermining a prophet in front of a crowd was not, according to these interpreters, a minor offense. It was an attack on the institution through which divine guidance reached the community. Early Christian commentators like Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century CE, took an allegorical approach. For Origen, the baldness of Elisha represented the apparent bareness of Christian teaching when stripped of the hair of Jewish law. The mocking youth represented those who rejected the message, and the bears represented, well, Origen's allegory gets quite elaborate. The point is that he was not reading the story as primarily a historical account to be taken at face value. Jerome, the 4th century scholar who produced the Latin Vulgate translation, took a more historical approach, but emphasized the corporate and prophetic dimensions of the insult, arguing that the youth were not merely mocking a bald man but were rejecting the prophetic office, and, by extension, the God who commissioned it. None of these readings is universally accepted, but they illustrate something important. The interpretive tradition surrounding this passage is ancient, it's multi-layered, and demonstrates that thoughtful readers across many centuries recognize the difficulty and engaged with it seriously. To understand this story on its own terms, we need to spend some time understanding what prophetic authority meant in ancient Israelite society, because it's quite different from what most modern people might assume. In the ancient Near East broadly, and this is documented not just in the Bible, but in extra-biblical sources from Mari, Assyria, and elsewhere, prophets functioned as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. They were not simply preachers or moral teachers. They were figures through whom, in the understanding of their communities, divine communication and divine power flowed. Archaeologists and historians of ancient Israel, including William Dever, whose work on everyday Israelite religion is widely cited, note that the prophetic tradition in Israel existed within a complex social world. There were court prophets, independent prophets, prophetic guilds, and individual figures who stood apart from institutional structures. Elisha, in the narrative of Kings, is presented as an independent figure with significant social power. He advises kings. He is consulted in military crises. He performs acts that demonstrate, in the narrative's framework, divine backing. In this context, public mockery of a prophet was not culturally equivalent to, say, making fun of someone's appearance in a modern setting. It was, according to the cultural logic of the text, closer to a public declaration that the prophet's authority was illegitimate, that his connection to the divine was false. Now, and this is important, recognizing the cultural logic does not mean endorsing it. We can understand why a text produced in that cultural context would present the story the way it does without concluding that the response described was proportionate or morally ideal by any standard, including the Bible's own developed standards. This is a distinction that scholars sometimes call the difference between descriptive and normative reading, between understanding what a text says happened and what it prescribes as a model for behavior. Here's a question that the text raises but doesn't fully answer. What is the relationship between Elisha's curse and the bear's appearance? The text says Elisha cursed them in the name of the Lord. It then says the bears came out. It does not say, and the Lord sent the bears, or and God caused the mauling. This gap has led some interpreters to suggest that the bears were a natural occurrence, that bears did live in the hill country of ancient Israel, which is historically accurate, as scholars of ancient Near Eastern fauna confirm, and that the narrative presents their appearance as providentially connected to the curse without necessarily claiming direct divine mechanical causation. Others read the text as clearly implying divine agency, that the curse in God's name and the bear's appearance are meant to be understood as connected. This distinction may seem subtle, but it matters theologically. Is this a story about God directly harming young people, or a story about a prophet operating with a certain kind of authority within a particular cultural framework and a natural event being interpreted through that framework? The text, honestly, supports multiple readings, and different interpretive traditions have landed in different places. It's also worth stepping back and looking at Elisha's character across the full sweep of the stories about him, because the bear incident is one episode among many, and reading it in isolation distorts the picture. Across the Elisha cycle, the dominant portrait is of someone who uses his prophetic gifts in service of vulnerable people. He provides food for the poor. He helps a widow avoid losing her children to debt slavery, an institution that existed in ancient Israel, as documented in both biblical and extra-biblical sources. He heals a foreign military commander, Naaman, of skin disease, a story notable precisely because the healing crosses ethnic and national lines. He is depicted raising a child from death. The scholarly consensus, as reflected in commentaries from people like Terence Fretheim and Richard Nelson, is that the Elisha cycle as a whole presents a figure whose prophetic power is consistently oriented toward life, healing, and provision, particularly for those on the social margins. The bear incident within this larger portrait reads as anomalous. It's one of the few stories in the cycle where Elisha's power results in harm rather than healing. Some scholars have suggested this is precisely the point, that the story functions within the narrative as an early, stark demonstration of the power that has been transferred to Elisha from Elijah, establishing his prophetic credentials in a way that the following healing stories then reframe and develop. In other words, the disturbing story may be doing literary work within the larger narrative that isn't immediately obvious when you read it in isolation. It's worth noting that the combination of prophetic power and severe supernatural consequences for mockery or disrespect is not unique to this passage or to the Hebrew Bible. In Greek literature, figures like Tiresias, the prophet, who appears in Homer and Sophocles, are surrounded by stories of divine punishment for those who disrespect or harm them. In ancient Near Eastern literature, more broadly, the power of curse, particularly curse invoked in the name of a deity, was understood as a real and dangerous force. Curse, tablets, incantation texts, and legal documents from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant all reflect a cultural world in which curses were taken seriously as having genuine efficacy. This doesn't validate the theological claims involved, but it situates the story within a broader ancient cultural framework where the kind of power being attributed to Elisha would have been understood by the original audience, within an established conceptual vocabulary. The question of how modern readers across different theological and secular frameworks should relate to that vocabulary is a separate and important question. Before we go further, I want to address some common misreadings of this passage that circulate widely. It is not a license for religious figures to harm critics. No serious Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox interpretive tradition reads this passage as prescribing that religious leaders should call down supernatural harm on those who criticize them. That reading is not supported by the text, by the broader canon, or by any mainstream interpretive tradition across the history of these communities. It is not evidence that the God of the Hebrew Bible is simply violent and arbitrary. That reading, which is popular in certain atheist or anti-religious discourse, treats this single passage as representative of a whole, ignoring the vast body of material in the same text that presents divine character in terms of justice, mercy, and covenant faithfulness. Selective reading works in any direction, but it doesn't constitute careful analysis. It is not a proof text for corporal punishment of children. This reading surfaces occasionally in certain religious subcultures and is not supported by the textual, historical, or interpretive tradition surrounding the passage. It is not the strangest or most difficult passage in the Hebrew Bible. That framing, while rhetorically effective, flattens the genuine interpretive tradition by treating difficulty as scandal rather than as an invitation to careful engagement. At some level, how you relate to the bear incident depends on a prior question. What kind of book do you think the Bible is? If you approach it as a flat, uniform document where every verse carries equal weight and equal genre, then the bear story is simply a factual account of something God did, and you're left defending it as is or rejecting it entirely. If you approach it as a library, which is closer to what the word biblia, meaning books, actually suggests, containing multiple genres written across centuries, reflecting developing theological understanding, then the picture is more complex and more interesting. Many serious theologians across the centuries, not liberal accommodationists trying to avoid difficulty, but rigorous thinkers committed to the authority of Scripture, have argued that the Bible itself presents a trajectory of theological development. The Psalms include cries for violent revenge against enemies that sit in tension with the call to love enemies that appears later. The conquest narratives describe acts of violence that later prophetic voices within the same canon appear to problematize. The understanding of divine justice in Job is arguably more sophisticated than what's presented in earlier wisdom literature. What this means for the Elisha story is something like this. The story is preserved within a tradition that is itself in ongoing conversation about the nature of divine power, prophetic authority, and human dignity. The bear incident is part of that conversation, not a final statement about it. Scholars in what's sometimes called canonical criticism, associated with figures like Brevard Childs, argue that the meaning of any biblical passage is shaped by its place within the whole of the canon, not just its immediate context. Read within that whole, the severe prophetic power of the bear story is eventually recontextualized by texts that present divine power, primarily through mercy, healing, and what the prophets call hesed, loving kindness. There's another angle worth exploring, and it's one that commentary writers have noted for a long time. The story immediately precedes a series of episodes in which Elisha's prophetic power is used for healing, provision, and rescue. Structurally, the bear incident appears at the very beginning of Elisha's independent ministry, right after he has received Elijah's mantle and demonstrated his authority by parting the Jordan River and purifying the waters of Jericho. The sequence, according to scholars like Robert Cohn, who has written on the literary structure of the Elisha cycle, possibly functions as an establishment of prophetic authority before the ministry narrative proper begins. Ancient readers would have been familiar with the idea that a prophet's authority needed to be established before their works of provision and healing could carry full weight. The severe incident may serve, within the narrative logic, as a kind of credential, a demonstration that the power at work in Elisha is real and serious, after which the dominant mode of his ministry shifts decisively toward life and healing. This is a literary reading, not a moral justification, but it helps explain why the story sits where it does in the narrative. I want to come back to the baldness for a moment because I think it's underappreciated. In the ancient world, and this is documented in multiple ancient sources, hair was frequently associated with identity, power, and status. The Samson narrative in the Book of Judges is the most famous Hebrew Bible example. His strength was, in the narrative's framework, connected to his uncut hair as a Nazirite vow. Shaving or hair loss could symbolize mourning, humiliation, or the stripping of status. In some ancient contexts, prophets and cultic figures maintained distinctive hair or head covering practices as markers of their role. Some scholars, including Susan Ackerman, who has written on gender and religion in ancient Israel, have suggested that Elisha's baldness may have been, within his cultural context, a visible marker of his prophetic identity, rather than simply a physical characteristic. If so, the mockery of his baldness was not teasing someone about their looks. It was attacking the visible sign of his sacred office. This reading isn't universally accepted, but it adds another layer to the interpretation that moves the incident away from God-punished children for making fun of a bald man towards something more culturally specific and, in its own terms, more internally coherent. I want to be careful here because I think there's a real risk of forcing a tidy lesson onto a genuinely difficult story, and that dishonors both the text and the reader. But there are some honest observations that seem worth making. 1. Difficulty in a text is not a reason to stop reading. The bear story is uncomfortable. It should be. Easy texts don't require much of us. Difficult ones force us to develop our interpretive muscles, our theological thinking, and our willingness to hold tension without collapsing it prematurely. 2. The full portrait of Elisha complicates the snapshot. Judging any figure, biblical or historical, by their worst moment or their most ambiguous moment is neither fair nor illuminating. Elisha, across the full narrative, is consistently oriented toward healing and provision. That doesn't make the bear story disappear, but it does prevent it from being the whole story. 3. The question of proportionality in divine action is ancient and ongoing. The people who preserved, compiled, and canonized these texts were not naive. They were sophisticated thinkers, grappling with real questions about justice, power, and suffering. Those questions didn't stop being asked after the canon closed. They're still being asked. The text gives us a conversation partner, not a final answer. 4. Mockery of what is genuinely sacred has consequences. This is perhaps the most straightforwardly applicable observation, stated carefully. Not that God will send bears, but that treating what is genuinely valuable, whether that's prophetic truth, human dignity, or the sacred, as something to be casually sneered at, has costs. Not always immediate, not always dramatic, but real. That's a principle most wisdom traditions across cultures affirm, regardless of their position on this specific text. I want to spend a few minutes on how this story has been received across later tradition, because it's a fascinating thread. In rabbinic literature, according to scholars of Talmudic interpretation, there are discussions about whether Elisha acted correctly or whether the curse was in some sense an excess, a moment of prophetic power that, even if permitted, wasn't necessarily ideal. The Talmud in Tractate Sota preserves a tradition that suggests Elisha was later punished with illness, the skin condition mentioned in 2 Kings, partly as a consequence of certain actions, though the specific connection to the bear incident is debated. This is striking. A tradition that takes prophetic authority seriously enough to preserve the bear story is also willing to entertain the possibility that Elisha's use of that authority in this instance was not beyond question. In Christian tradition, the most sustained engagement with the story is probably found in the allegorical readings of patristic writers, Origen, Cyril of Alexandria, Ephraim the Syrian, who, while very different from each other, share a tendency to read the Old Testament stories as pointing forward to spiritual realities rather than serving primarily as historical models. In the modern period, the story has been the subject of academic articles, theological essays, and congregational sermons that range across a very wide spectrum of interpretation. A 2003 article in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament by Brian Gabbe, for example, examines the literary function of the episode within the Elisha cycle in considerable detail. Homiletical treatments range from those that take a strong supernatural authority line to those that focus almost entirely on the cultural and literary context. The conversation is genuinely alive. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I want to pull it together honestly. The story of Elisha and the bears does not have a clean resolution. Anyone who tells you it does, whether they're dismissing the Bible as barbaric or defending every detail as straightforwardly normative, is, according to the weight of the scholarly and interpretive tradition, probably oversimplifying. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is this. The passage is textually complex, with key terms, including the word for the youth and the nature of the curse, carrying more ambiguity than popular retellings suggest. It sits within a literary context, the Elisha cycle, that is predominantly oriented toward healing and provision, making this episode structurally anomalous and possibly functioning as an establishment of prophetic credentials, rather than a template for prophetic behavior. It reflects a cultural world, ancient Israel, in the early first millennium BCE, as best we can reconstruct it, in which prophetic authority carried a social weight that is difficult to translate directly into modern categories. It has generated sophisticated interpretive engagement across Jewish and Christian traditions for over 2,000 years, with no single interpretation achieving consensus. And it raises questions about divine justice, prophetic authority, the nature of sacred office, and how we read difficult ancient texts that remain genuinely open and genuinely important. If you've sat with this story and felt troubled by it, you're in good company. The tradition of careful readers who felt troubled by it and kept reading anyway is a long and distinguished one. That's not a weakness. That's what serious engagement with a serious text looks like. Thanks for thinking through this with me today. If you found this kind of careful historical and theological exploration valuable, I'd encourage you to share it with someone else who wrestles with these questions. Because the conversation is always better with more voices in it. There are many more passages like this one, texts that have troubled readers for centuries and rewarded those who took the trouble seriously. We'll keep exploring them.